And welcome back to the Vesque Luxe Talks of Life podcast series. Today we're joined by Karen and Camden Devereaux of Northeast Kingdom Hemp, an organic grower of hemp for CBD, to talk about hemp farming and extraction. So welcome and thank you for joining us. So how did you get started growing hemp and how long have you been involved with it?
So we got started kind of without a plan. My husband came home one day and said, "Did you know you can grow hemp in Vermont and it's legal?" And I looked at him kind of dumb and said, "Yeah, so? Like, why would we want to do that?" I had not ever heard of CBD at the time. And he said, "Well, it's really good for people and doctors are telling people that they should use it." And so he wanted me to look up a bunch of stuff. And so we did that. And I found that it was good for arthritis, which my mom suffers with a lot of arthritis pain. So I said, let me try some, get some for my mom and see if it does anything for her. And if it helps, then sure, why not? I'll jump in and try to help. So that's kind of what we did. And it was sort of a race because I think he came home with that news maybe late March. And it was either find some seeds and start or wait a whole year, which my husband does not have patience for that.
Okay.
So we kind of just jumped right in and sourced some seeds and got started.
Now, how many years back was that?
And so that was in the spring of 2017. So okay. We've planted 3 crops since the beginning.
Okay, great. So what steps are necessary to achieve the organically grown designation that you folks enjoy?
Basically, it's an application process. They ask you lots of questions and they have to come here and do an inspection and make sure that you're truly using all organic fertilizers and no chemicals. And every year you have to kind of reapply and get recertified and have somebody come out and check you out. And they can do that at any time. There's a lot of logging and tracking that they want you to do as the year goes on. I think that's about it.
In terms of the actual farming process, then, is it a pretty significant undertaking to kind of convert into an organic grown environment?
My husband had always kind of grown organically anyway.
Yeah. And if the land is already organic, luckily, I think it has to be grown organically or not grown for a number of years since the previous time the land was worked. So luckily for us, the land was already certified organic for the last few years. And then it just had some cows on it the last few years before we started farming it. So it was easy for us to get the land certified organic. And then they go through and check out your whole process and all the fertilizers you use and all the dirts and potting soils. So we pretty much grew organically already anyway. So it wasn't really that difficult to make sure everything was organic. We maybe used a few different things here or there that were not totally 100% organic, but
some slight changes were all we really
very
had
slight
to make.
Changes. And then it was quite a bit of work to get the extraction facility certified organic, just because there aren't very many certified organic facilities. So there's not really a lot of regulations or what will qualify us organic, but they came through and everything that we do, we only use carbon dioxide and then we use organic ethanol that's evaporated off. So it's all clean. And so once they come through and look and see what's actually happening, they were able to give us a certification.
Well, terrific. Congratulations on attaining that. Now, what are the basic steps in cultivating, growing, and extracting hemp for CBD? Just to help folks understand, I know it's a very intensive process and it's not as easy as perhaps people think it might be, kind of diving into the arena. Yeah,
so kind of we can split it up between growing hemp and then the processing we'll call it 2 different parts, I guess. But the basic steps for the cultivating and growing, you got to get either seeds or clones. So you've got to get the hemp plants, the genetics somewhere in there. Either you start them yourself or buy them. And then you usually get them started. For us up here, we have to get them started a few months before we can put them outside just to get them big enough, and because our season's pretty short. So we start in our house in the basement, and then we move them to our greenhouse as the temperature allows. Probably pretty soon here we'll be able to move out to the greenhouse. and then in early May we'll start putting them outside. But all of April we're
Early May in the greenhouse. No.
early May we're putting them outside in the
ground?
field. Yeah. And then pretty much all of maybe later May, I guess,
Yeah, I
is when
think
we're
it's
starting
closer
to plant.
June. We're not really the farmers. My husband's the real farmer.
Okay.
But we watch and see what he's doing. Right now
Okay.
he's in cloning phase right now and starting babies, and they will get to the greenhouse, and then early, because we can have a frost right up until the 1st of June. So or freezing temperatures. So usually it's the first late May or early June before they can go in the ground.
Okay. And then for the extraction process, what are some of the growing and extraction processes? What are some of the keys here?
Yeah, so sure, they'll grow until September, October, and that's pretty much as long as we can let them go before the temperature starts getting cold. It's just long enough usually, but we'll harvest and then we'll dry all the plants in a barn and then in a closing greenhouse, so where we can monitor the temperature and humidity, make sure it's not too dry or too hot, and just barely enough so that it doesn't mold. And after that, it's bagged up for either smokable flour or for extraction. And kind of the extraction process, we'll take the hemp in and run it through a CO2 extraction machine and then clean up that extract with a few other post-processing steps, like removing the plant fat and the chlorophyll. And then we'll, depending on the finished product we're looking for, we'll decarb it to activate the CBD. And then we have to have it tested before we can formulate it. So there's a lot of steps in that whole extraction processing product before you get to a finished bottle.
So you start the process in February, March.
Unseen.
Yeah. I was going to say, you start the process
Yep.
in perhaps February, March, and when do you actually have CBD oil?
Well, if you just start the hemp in February, you won't have it until it's dried at the end of October, and then it takes about 2 or 3 weeks for me to make the oil. Once I get the hemp in the lab, probably 2 weeks, 3 weeks before I've turned it into. Usually what slows it down is getting it tested. If I didn't have to wait to have things tested, sometimes I could do it probably in 2 weeks, but
Okay.
that just is, it's a lot of work, and it's just tricky, and I have to kind of just do the testing when I'm testing. So I can't have other things going as much.
And I think our first year, when we were dependent on somebody else to do the extraction for us, we thought as soon as fall came, we'd be able to harvest and then get oil made. And realistically, it was the first of the following year, like it was the 1st of January before we actually had a product in hand. So I don't think that is too far, to assume it would take till December or January to actually have the finished product.
Okay. Well, kind of a surprise, I'm sure, to you and then to many who are getting involved in this, the length of the growth and the extraction process season. So what things have you done to ensure the quality and purity of your hemp and CBD oil?
Well, for one, we've made sure that we're able to be vertically integrated so that we control the process from the beginning to the end. Finding an extraction lab in Vermont wasn't that easy to find labs that could keep up with the demand. And then once the hemp leaves you're not really sure exactly what they're using or how they're doing it. So that's one thing that we do, is controlling the process and third-party testing everything along the way.
Great.
Yeah, and doing our own testing along the way, like testing our plants in the field in the fall, when to harvest, testing oil along the way while I'm processing to see if I can make any changes to things I'm doing, different temperatures or pressures, or just to save tastes and terpenes or to be more efficient. There's all kinds of stuff. There's so much testing along the way. And the vertical integration, we control every single step. Like it's in our hands every step of the way. We don't know. We never have to send it out and receive the product back and think we know what happened to it.
Yeah, that seems critical for.
We started out like that.
Yeah. Great. Now, what are the risks then involved in hemp growing and extraction? Probably too many to list, in a sense.
I think for us, well, especially when we started, hemp was actually still a federally not legal product. So that's one of the reasons that we didn't start out thinking that we'd be organic certified, because we figured, well, they're never going to certify an illegal product. So we started out growing organically, but didn't pursue an organic certification. So that's one of the reasons getting the organic certification once hemp became federally legal was easier for us, because we had sort of set out on that path in the beginning.
Got it.
But you know, banking is a risk. You know, initially, even today, there's still people get their credit card processors shut down. It's been a little quiet lately. I should knock on some fake wood or something, because, you know, for the last 2 years, it's been every time you turn around, somebody's credit card processor has shut them down because they're selling CBD products. So that's always sort of hanging over your head. Then there's the risk of the investment. I mean, in our case in particular, you know, purchasing the CO2 equipment and the testing equipment and all of that. And I think a lot of people got taken last year with the risk of buying genetics or clones from people and then finding that their crops were testing too hot or were prone to mold or powdery mildew or all that stuff. So, you know, it's farming. Like my husband said, it's farming. So it's bound to be risky. You're at the mercy of Mother Nature.
Got it. And the regulators in the market. What type of extraction method do you prefer? Yeah. What type of extraction method do you prefer?
The carbon dioxide extraction we believe is the cleanest. It's definitely not the most efficient. For what we're doing, the small batch is great. We're able to take the hemp and extract it and use the same terpenes from the same plants to reintroduce back into the tinctures. When you use other types of extraction, it's a lot harsher, and you have to either clean up the extract so much that you burn off all the terpenes, or you can't even taste them, and you can reintroduce artificial terpenes, but we're able to save and reuse the same terpenes from the same hemp. And you just can't do that with ethanol or with a lipid extraction and then there's a butane method of extraction, which does produce a good product, but it's incredibly dangerous and illegal in Vermont, and I think is more used for like high THC products, because it's a good process, but you have to have a very specific static proof room. Like it's a bomb in a lab.
Yeah, it's a bomb.
It's a bomb.
Something waiting to explode. And I think for us, even though like we leaned towards CO2 from the beginning, because the products that we initially tried, you know, there's a lipid extraction method that's basically soaking it in coconut oil. It's simple. It doesn't yield a very good tasting product. CO2 yields a good, clean tasting product. And I think it uses the plant efficiently. Like Camden said, we're not wasting any parts of the plant. We're not burning out all the terpenes. We're able to get all the goodness out of the plant. Whereas some of those other processes, they can process hundreds of pounds of hemp in a day that we can't do, but they're not really getting everything they can out of that material.
Okay. So does that help with the entourage effect and the full spectrum element of hemp, perhaps,
to
use
totally.
the CO2 method? Terrific.
Totally.
We think so.
And are there any particular strains or type of hemp plant that you favor growing?
We started out with a box strain out of Colorado, and that has pretty much been our go-to, the most legal. It doesn't have the highest CBD. It's only 8 to 10% CBD, but it's 0.3 THC all the time. We've
mold resistant.
It's very, very hardy. And we've got also a cherry wine we picked up the next year out of Oregon that has been pretty well too. Maybe a little bit higher CBD, maybe a little bit less mold resistant, but really not much. We've had a couple other strains. We've tried other ones that we bought from people in Vermont, and they've all come back either too high THC and you have to get rid of them, or mold, they'll mold or they'll get disease. These are
consistent and then
original.
Yeah, and my husband has, you know, played around with crossing those strains and made his own sort of concoctions that way.
Neat. And how many varieties are available? Sounds like there's probably a wealth of these things that are out there.
There really are a lot, because you can just cross and cross the different breeds and make more and more different strains. So it all goes back to the originals, and some people get them from different places, but there's um, there's just so much. Like, we can shop online in Vermont and find cherry wine box crosses and cherry blossom box and just
Cherry pie.
cherry pie, and they're probably the same
Okay.
strain. They're just someone else crossed them, and it's a different name. So
Right. They named them. My husband's decided he can name them whatever he wants now.
There you go. Okay. So what, if anything, should consumers be on the lookout for?
So I always tell people, you buy whatever you want. There's a huge amount of options out there, but you should always ask, where was the hemp grown? Because I think that's important. I think there's a difference between hemp that's grown on a small family farm in Vermont that's hand tended versus hemp that was grown on an industrial hemp field
in Kentucky,
in Kentucky, hundreds of
100,000
acres, bioaccumulating who knows what out of the ground.
Okay.
You should want to know how the CBD was extracted from the hemp. Just because I think you should know that if you're going to put it in your body. So, and then you should not buy anything. I still pick up labels. It shocks me that we're this far into the process, and I can still go in a store and pick up labels that don't actually even say how much CBD is in the bottle, or don't say how it was extracted. I just feel like those are things people should know, because when you're comparing two products, I don't think that our product should be compared with another product that was, a lipid extraction. If you can't just compare dollar for dollar. You should know those important things, and it should be for sure third-party tested.
Okay.
and you really get what you pay for too. A lot of products are higher priced, but the quality, there's such a range in quality, from the lower price stuff to ours is kind of the medium high, but there's even higher price stuff. But there's a range.
Now, speaking of testing, then, how does one read a certificate of analysis, and what makes up a COA report?
A lot of people have a hard time.
You have to
and
live
I think
this.
The problem is every lab is a different looking. Every lab COA looks a little bit different. So you have to find the numbers, the max CBD, the max THC. Those are the most important. And you want to look for either the percent concentration, and if it's milligrams per gram, milligrams per milliliter, or that's so.
You never know what it's going to be.
It's tricky too, because a tincture that says it's 1,500 milligrams per ounce of tincture, if you look at the COA, it's going to tell you that the CBD is 5%, which to someone who doesn't really know, that doesn't make much sense. But what it's saying is there's 50, if it's 5%, it's 50 milligrams per milliliter. And in that bottle of 30 milliliters, 50 times 30 is 1,500. So there's some math when you look at the test report too, that to figure out if it's actually what it says. And then with the THC, that one's a little bit simpler, because it's usually 0.3 or lower, or 3 milligrams per mil.
But I think there's a lot. Initially, I don't know if they were doing it. I don't think the testing facilities were doing it on purpose. I think that marketers do some of that sort of foggy reporting on their labels on purpose to confuse consumers, because I think that it's really difficult. People, I'll look at two bottles, people will ask me, what's the difference between yours and this one that I got in the mail? And I'm like, well, tell me a little bit about the one you got in the mail. How much CBD is actually in it? And they'll say, oh, well, it doesn't really say. And I'm like, well, how much CBD per dosage? It doesn't really say. So, there's things like that people need to know to look for. And then those COAs, I really ask Camden to read them most of the time, because if you don't notice that one might be reporting milligrams per milliliter and the next one might be milligrams per gram. And so
the numbers are different.
It's really easy to get confused.
Yeah, it is absolutely confusing. Good, thank you.
And people get confused a lot about the max and potential THC. A lot of flour, before it's decarbed or before it's been heated, only has THCA, which is not active THC. So if you have to account for the non-decarbed THCA as well as the active delta 9, because you can have a flower that's 0.3% delta 9, 4% THCA, but they can show you that it's only 0.3% delta 9 because it's fresh and not decarbed. And you wouldn't really know unless you look up and see that it's 4% THCA. When you decarb that, it's going to be 4% plus the 4.3% THC. So you have to really check that out too.
So the main lines then for consumers is exactly what you're saying, the THC line, the THCA, and then also the CBD, correct? That's what, because I know a lot of people get kind of held up on looking at maybe the CBG or the CBN if that's out there, but those are the two primary lines that they should be looking at.
Yeah, those other cannabinoids usually are such trace amounts. It's cool when they're there, but the most important numbers are the CBD and your total THC. I was just going to say, when you see a COA that maybe has trace amounts of CBG or CBC or CBN, it could be because it's been better preserved along the process. So you haven't lost those trace cannabinoids like you would with an ethanol or a lipid extraction. So that can be a good thing for sure, but it's not always that important. Some of our tinctures are just diluted to the point where in the COA, the CBG and the CBC don't show up, but in our higher strength tincture, they do. They're there. They're just below the limit of quantitation. So it is, yeah.
And I think it's probably good to point out as well, we've talked about in the past full spectrum CBD versus broad spectrum versus the isolates. If a consumer is looking at a COA and they don't know off the top of their head what type of CBD it is, the other cannabinoids will let them know that it more likely is full spectrum if they exist in there versus they're only just being CBD, right? Then it's most likely an isolate or...
Yeah.
Okay, great.
Sure.
Cool, great.
Yeah, that's a really good way to tell.
Awesome. So I'd like to dive back into some more about the farming and growing of hemp. And we know that light is important for all plants, but how does light impact yield and the grow cycle for hemp?
More light is always better. The most important thing is kind of the photo period. So the hours of light and the hours of dark. Hemp will not flower if it doesn't have at least 12 hours of dark. So that is really the most important. If you're growing outdoors, you need that certain time of year to turn the hemp to flower. Otherwise, it'll just keep vegging and growing and it will not bud.
Right. And I think a lot of people got caught with that last year. They put plants in super late. They were still putting plants in the ground in July, almost up into August. And my husband was like, they're going to flower
as soon as they come out of the ground
because of the photo period. They're going to flower way before they're really mature. So I think people didn't understand that. They thought, well, it's still warm, and my husband would be like, would you put a tomato in the ground in Vermont, in the middle of July and expect to yield anything? So it's really the same thing. They need that time with the light being however many hours a day to bring them to that point where they flower. And if you put them in late, they're going to flower when they're only a foot tall. And that's not really going to yield a whole lot.
Now, I imagine strain by strain, it probably varies on the flowering cycle with light versus others. Are they all really consistent and the same to grow, or does it really change by strain?
It does change by strain. The strains we have are pretty consistent with each other. There are other strains. Seems like a higher sativa strain takes a little bit longer. They need maybe a couple more weeks to become fully mature. And then the heavier indica plants and the hemp too, they come in a little earlier. Takes a few less weeks to get to full maturity.
Great. Now, how about nutrients? I know nutrients are always talked about a lot with farming. Is there any nutrients that you folks use or any that you've seen that's best for growing hemp? Additives to the soil, anything like that?
So you have to add lime if your pH is low. If you're acidic. It's really just nitrogen. Nitrogen's definitely the biggest one. Nitrogen will help you have nice green leaves when you're vegging, and it'll grow. It's just a lot of energy for the plants. And then once they start to flower, you can give them. I think we start out with a lot more nitrogen, and then as they flower, we back off with the nitrogen and add a little bit more of the potassium to for some reason that is what they like to when they're maturing.
We're lucky we work with a person from North Country Organics, and he's really smart.
Yeah,
and so we test our soil, and he lets us know, what we need and how much of it we need. My husband works with him pretty closely, and he knows when's the right time to give them a dose of whatever.
We're still learning
yeah.
a lot of that.
We don't want to know all the farming ins and outs. I know.
Yeah, but your husband certainly has the experience and the instincts to make it all work.
Yeah, that's the part. That's this part.
Yeah, I have heard in the past from farmers, and I've read some studies where they said that after going through a hemp cycle through their crops, it actually added to the biodiversity in the soil, and it made the soil better for a lot of the other crops they were growing. So it's fascinating to see that kind of take place with hemp. Now, are there, I'm curious about how you're able to ensure that your crop has that legal threshold of THC. I know before we talked about certain strains that you purchase. Do those strains really ensure that you'll have under or at least a regulated amount of 0.3% THC?
Yeah, you have to hope so if it's the first time you buy the strain. And then in the fall, you can have samples tested to kind of determine when that THC is getting to its peak, or if it's some strains will go over, you just have to pick them early. So really the best way to know is to have samples of your hemp tested in the field in the fall, like starting in July and then a couple in August maybe. And then when you're getting ready to harvest, it's usually you want to get a test within a week of when you harvest to be the most accurate of what your levels are going to be.
Yeah, our farmer is a firm believer in, you can let your crop grow longer, trying to get bigger buds and more CBD, but while you're doing that, your THC is also going to be climbing. So it's kind of a balancing act of testing along the way so that you get them in time.
And really having the right genetics is the only way to, once you have genetics you're comfortable with and know won't climb higher, then you should be safe. And they vary a little bit each year, but that's the most important, having something that you know is going to be low THC and picking it as early as you have to, but you shouldn't have to pick it too early if it's a true 0.3% THC.
Right. Now, are there any newer technologies that you're using up there on the farm to grow or extract the hemp? Or is there anything that you've heard of that's in the market now that you're excited about and you might look to get one day?
I guess our newest technology that we're using is we have the high pressure liquid chromatography for testing now. So I'm able to test our samples in the field ourselves. I don't have to send out samples. And that just saves us a lot of time and a lot of money and a lot of questioning. So that's really the most new technology we've been using.
Yeah, we're kind of old school, like my husband's been growing the way he grows. He likes to do things the way he does them. We go to a lot of events where they come and they say, oh, I can sell you this bud trimmer that'll trim your flower and so much faster. And I usually look at them and say, we have a bud trimmer. His name is Steve, and we like Steve. We don't really want to get rid of him. They can sell you a machine to do just about anything. We prefer to use people to do that when we can. And have everything be a little more hand tended than the machine operated.
Terrific.
Yeah, I think that's always good. Now, as far as like insects or anything like that, I know your husband's the farmer, but have you experienced any type of insects that have affected the plant, or have you had to do anything to protect your plants from any type of insects at all?
We're kind of lucky living where we do. The climate's so cold most of the year. We don't have a lot of pests. This last year, we had some aphids that kind of came up that were new coming up from the south. That's really all we've had to deal with. And really all we did was them is I just started buying and looking into beneficial insects like ladybugs and praying mantises. And you can spray plants to kill the aphids, but it's probably not the best.
We use bugs.
We found that the ladybugs were enough to deal with the aphids. A lot of ladybug larvae, they eat like 10 aphids a minute. They go crazy.
And really the only other problem we've had was with like slugs in a wet season.
Yeah.
If you've got a lot of grass growing up around the base of your plants and the slugs come in, they can eat through the stalks and cause some problems. But we find that if we just keep the grass low around the plants, because we don't till our field, we just dig holes for each individual plant. So we have grass in between, but if we keep that grass low around the plants, then we don't have that problem.
Yeah, it seems like
and that probably would be different for some warmer climate. But
it seems like, you folks are doing it in really the way that plants were probably supposed to grow out of the ground themselves. And,
also leads to the conference of the organic labeling too, because you're kind of natively organic in terms of your approach.
Okay, great. So, so the plant has grown, it's gone through its light cycle, it's had its nutrients, and, it's budded, and it's ready for harvest. Do you mind walking me through the steps that you take from when you actually harvest the plant through maybe drying and then all the way through extraction?
Yeah, I can kind of talk through. So what we do first is we'll pick out the big buds in the field that we want to save for our smokables. And we'll preserve those. We'll dry those in the greenhouse first before we bring in any more whole plants. And that just, we'll save those. We make sure they don't mold, and we've got them. We'll bag them as soon as they're dry. That way we know they're safe. And then with the rest of the plants, we'll hang them in a barn until we can bring them into our closed-in greenhouse where we can monitor the temperature and humidity a little better. Because it's too humid and moist out in the fall here to dry the plants outside. So you have to bring them inside somehow. So we've got a pretty big greenhouse that we can control about 60% humidity and about 65 degrees. So
they start in the barn, but then they're
brought into the
finished
greenhouse.
dry happens in the greenhouse where we can control things a little bit more.
And as they're hanging in the greenhouse, once they dry, what we'll do is we'll shuck and cut the bigger buds and all of the biomass from the stems and bag all of that and compost the stems. But after those bags, we usually bag those up into 50-gallon bags. And those will be brought into the lab to be gone through again. All the bigger buds will be picked out again. And the smaller biomass and like the raffinate material will be ground up and bagged again for extraction. So we've got a lot of bags. Got bags of hemp that's not ground, bags of ground hemp, bags of buds, and
small buds, big buds.
Big buds.
It sounds from here in Connecticut, we have a long history of tobacco farming. I have friends that had done that, and it sounds like it's at least a portion of the process is similar. Now, are you folks able to make use of all of the plant material? So are you able to sell off everything from the extracted CBD to what's left over after the actual, you cut down the crop and everything? Are you able to use all of the plant mass itself?
Right now we're looking kind of for something to do with the stem. We don't produce enough of the stem to really be worth much to anybody, and our plants are kind of small and bushy compared to long, skinny fiber hemp stalks. So it's more difficult to use. They're kind of gnarly and rough and all kinds of knots and branches coming out of them. So we're looking
not too good for making rope then, right?
But
right.
No, not the same stuff.
No, and basically the rest of the plant, the different grades of flower we use either for smokable products or for extraction. And then actually the dried hemp that comes out of the CO2 extractor after all the oil's been taken out, we have found a mushroom farmer that wants to use some of that for fertilizer or compost.
Yeah, for growing edible.
And then my husband uses it to sand the driveway in the wintertime. It works pretty good. We have a nice green sprinkled driveway on the slippery, icy days. So we're trying to use it.
Yeah, neat cycle of life, yeah.
Great. Now we know you're up there in Vermont, which is close to Canada, and that brings up the question on if farmers like yourself are able to do business with other countries yet, and if you are, what type of laws do you have to go through in order to, either transport hemp across borders or do any type of trade?
Or is it even conceivable at this point?
I think it's conceivable. We have heard of other farmers that are doing it. We have not found what we believe to be like a legal way of doing that yet. I mean, our lawyer is actually talking about like it's right on the horizon, but it's not anything that we have felt comfortable doing yet. It just didn't seem like it doesn't seem like it's completely open.
Great. And, we like to end our podcast with asking our guests what excites them most. So what excites you most in this space, and or what are you most excited about going forward in your own business?
Oh, goodness. I think the exciting part right now, I think everybody's just trying to survive. But, I'm kind of hoping that it's a very immature market. And that's one of the things that I don't think people understand. And, there was a huge surge of people growing hemp in Vermont this past season. And I think a lot of lessons were learned. I'm excited to see the market sort of stabilize a little bit, and not really for the strong to survive necessarily, but for some of the lesser quality products to maybe get weeded out of the market, so it's a little less confusing for consumers, and that they can trust that the things that are still out there are really of good quality. And I think just to continue getting feedback from customers. We're so lucky to have a customer base that spreads the word by word of mouth, so that our customer base keeps growing based on the effectiveness of our products. And that's pretty exciting.
Well, good. Thank you again, Karen and Camden, and continued good fortune at Northeast Kingdom Hemp, and more to come.
Thank you guys for having us on here.
We love working with you.
you.